Welcome! This video explores World War I, its origins, battles, and lasting consequences. Let's begin. History remembers a single bullet fired on a sunny day in Sarajevo, a bullet that didn't just kill a man, but ignited a conflict that would consume the globe, redraw the map of Europe, and leave a generation shattered. This is the story of World War I, a war that was not inevitable, but one that had been brewing in the shadows for decades. The year is 1914. Europe is a continent of empires, a tinderbox of tension, and a fragile peace built on a complex web of alliances. But before we get to the spark, we must understand the powder keg. Four major factors lay the groundwork for the Great War. First, militarism. The great powers of Europe were in a frantic arms race. Germany and Britain were locked in a naval rivalry, while across the continent, military spending skyrocketed. The belief was that a strong military was the key to national security and prestige, making war seem not only possible but a valid tool of foreign policy. Second, alliances. Europe was divided into two armed camps. On one side, the Triple Entente, a pact between Britain, France, and Russia. On the other, the Triple Alliance, uniting Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. These were not just friendships, they were solemn promises of mutual defense. An attack on one was an attack on all. Third, imperialism. The world was being carved up by colonial powers. Britain, France, and Germany were competing fiercely for land and resources in Africa and Asia. This economic rivalry and the constant jostling for influence fueled mistrust and hostility between the nations. And finally, nationalism. It was a powerful and often destructive force. People believed in the superiority of their own nation. In the Balkans, this was particularly explosive. Serbia, a small Slavic nation, dreamed of uniting all Slavic peoples in the region. This dream directly threatened the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which held millions of Slavic people within its borders. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, arrived in Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia. His visit was a show of imperial power, but it was seen as an insult by Serbian nationalists. As his motorcade passed through the streets, a young nationalist named Gavrilo Princip stepped forward and fired 2 shots, killing both the Archduke and his wife. The assassination was the match thrown into the tinderbox. Austria-Hungary, with the full support of Germany, issued a harsh ultimatum to Serbia. When Serbia failed to meet all demands, Austria-Hungary declared war. The dominoes began to fall. Russia mobilized to defend Serbia, leading Germany to declare war on Russia and then on France. When Germany invaded neutral Belgium to attack France, Britain, bound by treaty, declared war on Germany. The war began with a sense of romanticism. Soldiers on both sides believed they would be home by Christmas. Germany's plan, the Schlieffen Plan, was to quickly defeat France in the west before Russia could fully mobilize in the east. But the plan failed. The French and British held their ground at the Battle of the Marne. The war of movement ground to a halt. A new kind of warfare emerged. Trench warfare. Miles of trenches stretched from the Swiss border to the North Sea. The land between them, a desolate wasteland known as No Man's Land, became the most dangerous place on Earth. The Great War introduced the world to industrialized combat. Machine guns made frontal assaults suicidal. Armored tanks were first used to break the stalemate, but were often unreliable. Airplanes, initially used for reconnaissance, soon became tools of combat. And most terrifyingly, chemical weapons like chlorine and mustard gas were unleashed, causing horrific suffering. While the Western Front was a stalemate, the war was fought on many fronts. The Eastern Front saw vast armies clashing in a more mobile but equally brutal conflict. In the Ottoman Empire, the British launched a disastrous campaign at Gallipoli, while in the Middle East, the Arab Revolt threatened Ottoman rule. The war was also fought at sea. Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare, using U-boats to sink any ship approaching Britain, proved a turning point. It brought a neutral giant into the conflict. In 1917, after U-boats sank American merchant ships, President Woodrow Wilson declared war. The entry of the United States, with its immense industrial capacity and fresh troops, tipped the scales decisively in favor of the Allies. As the war dragged on, revolution broke out in Russia. The Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, took power and pulled Russia out of the war, signing a separate peace treaty with Germany. This allowed Germany to transfer troops from the Eastern Front for a final, desperate gamble, the Spring Offensive of 1918. It was a massive assault that pushed the Allies back, but it ultimately failed due to exhaustion and the arrival of fresh American troops. By the fall of 1918, the Central Powers were collapsing. The German High Command knew the war was lost. On the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, an armistice was signed, and the guns finally fell silent. The war was over, but the work was just beginning. The victorious powers gathered in Paris to negotiate the peace. The result was the Treaty of Versailles, a document that would forever be debated. Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for the war, pay crippling reparations, and lose territory. The Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires were dismantled, creating new nations in Central and Eastern Europe. But many historians argue that the harsh terms of the treaty created more problems than they solved. It bred resentment in Germany, which would be exploited by a new, dangerous leader just 2 decades later. The Great War was supposed to be the war to end all wars. It was anything but. It was a brutal reckoning that toppled empires, ushered in a new era of technology, and demonstrated the horrifying potential of industrialized conflict. It was a war that proved how a single act of violence could unleash forces no one could control. And in its wake, it left a world forever changed, and the seeds of a new and even more terrible conflict already beginning to take root. Thank you for watching, stay curious and take care.